Zeitoun, page 225, Wednesday, September 7th. When the sky began to pale into dawn, Zeitoun realized he had not slept at all. He had closed his eyes for a few minutes at a time, but had not found sleep. He refused to lie on the pavement, but even if he could have brought himself to do so, even if he could quell the panic about the situation, his family, his home, the uninterrupted drone of the engine would have kept him awake. He watched as the night guard left and was replaced by a new man. The new guard's expression was the same as his predecessor's, seeming to take for granted the guilt of the men in the cage. Zeitoun and Nasser performed their wudu and salat, and when they were done, they stared at the guard, who was staring at them. Zeitoun became more alert, even optimistic. As the sky brightened, he assumed that with each day since the hurricane, the city would find its way towards some kind of stability, and that the government would soon send help. With that help, the chaos that had brought him to this cage would be reined in, and the misunderstanding manifested here would be mitigated. Zeitoun convinced himself that the previous day had been an aberration, that today would bring a return to reason and procedure. He would be allowed a phone call, would learn about the charges against him, might even see a public defender or a judge. He would call Kathy, and she would hire the best lawyer she could find, and this would be over in hours. The other men in the cage, all of whom had finally found some rest during the night, woke one by one and stood to stretch. Breakfast was brought. Again it was MREs, this time including ham slices. Zeitoun and Nassar ate what they could and gave the rest to Todd and Ronnie. As the prison awoke, Zeitoun examined the chain-link structure closely. It was about 150 feet long. The razor wire was new, the portable toilets new, the fencing was new and of high quality. He knew that none of this had existed before the storm. New Orleans Union Passenger Terminal had never before been used as a prison. He did some rough calculations in his mind. It would have taken maybe 6 flatbed trucks to get all of the fencing to the station. He saw no forklifts or heavy machinery. The cages must have been assembled by hand. It was an impressive feat to get such a construction project completed so soon after the storm, but when had they done it? Zeitoun had been brought into the station on September 6, 7.5 days after the hurricane passed through the city. Even under the best of circumstances, building a prison like this would have taken 4 or 5 days. That meant that within a day of the storm's eye passing over the region, officials were taking plans for the building of a makeshift outdoor prison. Fencing and razor wire would have had to be located or ordered. The toilets and floodlights and all other equipment would have had to be borrowed or requisitioned. It was a vast amount of planning and execution. A regular contractor would have wanted weeks to complete the task, and would have used heavy machinery. Without machines, dozens of men would be needed. To do it as quickly as they had, 50 men would be needed, maybe more. And who were these men? Who did this work? Were there contractors and laborers working around the clock on prison days after the hurricane? It was mind-boggling. It was all the more remarkable given that while the construction was taking place on September 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, thousands of residents were being plucked from rooftops, were being discovered alive and dead in attics. At midday, Zeitoun heard something strange. The sound of buses at the bus station. He looked up to see a school bus arriving at the far end of the lot. From it descending 30 or more prisoners, one woman among them in orange jumpsuits. They were the incarcerated from the Jefferson Parish and Kenner jails, those who had been in jail before the storm. Within the hour, the long rows of cages began to fill, and again, just like Guantanamo, all prisoners could be seen by anyone from any angle. Now, with the orange uniforms completing the picture, the similarities were too strong to ignore. Quickly after each group was locked into a cage, they were warned about touching the fence. Any touching of any fence would result in severe consequences, and so they came to know the strange rules of their incarceration. The pavement would be their bed, the open-door toilet would be their bathroom, and the steel rack would be the seat they could share. But for the first hour, while the new prisoners got acquainted with their new cells, there was much yelling from the guards about where and how to stand and sit, what not to touch. A man and woman were housed one cage away from Zeitoun, and soon a rumor abounded that the man was a sniper, that it had been he who had been shooting at the helicopters that had tried to land on the roof of the hospital. Lunch was different than previous meals. This time the guards brought ham sandwiches to the cages and then stuffed them through the holes in the wire. Again, Zeitoun Nasser did not eat. The presence of dogs was constant. There were at least two always visible, their handlers sure to parade them past the cages in close proximity. Occasionally one would explode into barking at some prisoner. Someone in Zeitoun's cage mentioned Abu Ghraib, wondering at what point they'd be asked to pose naked in a vertical pyramid, and which guard would lean into the picture grinning. By 2 o'clock there were about 50 prisoners at the bus station, but Zeitoun's cage was still the only one with its own dedicated guard. You really think they consider us terrorists? Nasser asked. Todd rolled his eyes. Why else would we be alone in the cell while everyone else is crammed together? We're the big fish here. We're the big catch. Throughout the day, a half a dozen more prisoners came through the station and were brought to the cages. These men were dressed in their civilian clothes. They must have been picked up after the storm, as Zeitoun and his companions had been. The pattern was clear now. The prisoners who were being transferred from other prisons came by bus and weren't processed, while those arrested after the storm were processed inside and brought through the back door. By overhearing the guards and prisoners talking, Zeitoun realized the prison had been given at least two nicknames for the guards and soldiers. The few referred to it as Angola South, but far more were calling it Camp Greyhound. In the afternoon, one of the guards approached a man in the cage next to Zeitoun. He talked to an orange-clad prisoner for a few moments, gave him a cigarette, and then returned to the bus station. Moments later, the guard reappeared, leading a small television crew. The guard led them straight to the man he'd given a cigarette to. The reporter, Zeitoun could see now the crew was from Spain, conducting an interview with the prisoner. And then, after a few minutes, he approached Zeitoun with a microphone and began to ask a question. "No!" the guard yelled. "Not that one!" The crew was ushered back into the station. "Holy shit," Todd said. "They bribed that dude." As they were leaving, the cameraman swept his lens over the whole outward jail, Zeitoun included. There was a bright light attached to the camera, and being viewed that way in the glare of a floodlight had shown to the world as a criminal in a cage made Zeitoun furious. It was a lie. But Zeitoun had a sudden hope, given that the crew was Spanish, that the footage might be broadcast to his brother in Malaga. Ahmed would see it. He saw everything, and he would tell Kathy, and Kathy would know where he was. At the same time, Zeitoun couldn't bear the thought of his family in Syria knowing he was being kept like this. No matter what happened, if and when he was released, he could not let them know that this had happened to him. He did not belong here. He was not this. He was in a cage, being viewed, gaped at, seen as visitors to the zoo see exotic animals, kangaroos and baboons. The shame was greater than any his family had ever known. In the late afternoon, a new prisoner was brought through the bus station doors. He was white, about 50, thin, and of average height, with dark hair and tan skin. Zeitoun thought little of him until his own cage was opened and the man was pushed inside. There were now 5 prisoners in the cage. No one knew why. The man was dressed in jeans and a short-sleeved shirt and seemed to have stayed clean during and after the storm. His hands, face, and clothing were all without dirt or stain. His attitude, too, bore no shadow of the suffering of the city at large. He introduced himself to Zeitoun and the 3 others, shaking each of their hands like a confectioner. He said his name was Jerry. He was gregarious, full of energy, and made jokes about his predicament. The 4 men had spent a sleepless night in an outdoor cage and did not have the energy to make much conversation, but this new prisoner more than filled the silence. He laughed at his own jokes and about the bizarre situation they found themselves in. Without prompting, Jerry told the story of how he had come to be arrested. He had stayed behind during the storm, just as he always did during hurricanes. He wanted to protect his house, and after Katrina passed, he realized he needed food and couldn't walk to any stores nearby. His car was on a high ground and was undamaged, but he was out of gas, so he found the length of tubing in his garage and was in the middle of siphoning gasoline from a neighbor's car. He planned to tell his neighbor, who would have understood, he said, when he was discovered by a National Guard flatboat. He was arrested for theft. It was an honest misunderstanding. He said one that would be straightened out soon enough. Zeitoun pondered the many puzzling aspects to Jerry's presence. First, he seemed to be the only prisoner in the complex entertained by the state of affairs, being held at Camp Greyhound. Second, why had he been put in their cage? There were 15 other cages, many of them empty. There didn't seem to be any logic to taking a man brought in for gasoline siphoning and placing him in with 4 men suspected of working together on crimes varying from looting to terrorism. Jerry asked how the rest of them had come to be in Cape Greyhound. Told the story for the four of them. Jerry said something about how badly the four of them had gotten screwed. It was all common small talk, and Zeitoun was tuning out when Jerry changed his tone and line of questioning. He began to direct his efforts towards Zeitoun and SR. He asked questions that didn't flow from the conversational strands he had begun. He made despairing remarks about the United States. He joked about George W. Bush, about the administration's dismissal response to the disaster so far. He questioned the competence of the U.S. military, the wisdom of U.S. foreign policy around the world, and the Middle East in particular. Todd engaged with him, but Zeitoun and SR chose to remain quiet. Zeitoun was deeply suspicious, still trying to parse how this man had ended up in their cage, and what his intentions might be. Be nice to your mom. While Jerry talked, Zeitoun turned to see a prisoner a few cages away from him. He was white, in his mid-20s, thin, with long brown hair. He was sitting on the ground, his knees drawn up to his chest, and he was chanting the statement like a mantra, but loudly. Be nice to your mom, treat her kind. The other three detainees in the young man's cage were visibly annoyed by him. He had apparently been repeating these strange directives for some time, and Zeitoun had only begun to hear them. Don't play with matches, fire is dangerous, he said, rocking back and forth. The man was disabled in some way. Zeitoun watched him carefully. He was not right in the head. He seemed to have been stunted mentally at no more than 5 or 6 years of age. He recited basic rules and warnings that a very small child might be asked to memorize in kindergarten. Don't hurt your mom. Be nice to your mom. He went on like this. His cage mates hushed him and even nudged him with their feet, but he took no notice. He was in something like a trance state. Because the train engine was so loud, his chanting wasn't much of a nuisance for anyone else, but his child's mind could not seem to understand where he was or why. One of the guards sitting in a few yards away from the man's cage kept insisting that he stay in the middle of the enclosure, where he could be easily seen. Any movement left or right was forbidden, but the man in the cage didn't understand this. He would simply get up and move over to another side. What motivated the man to decide it was time to move from here to there was unclear, but the unprovoked and unsanctioned movement enraged the guard. Get back there, where I can see you, he yelled. The man didn't know he was being addressed. Brush your teeth before bed, he was saying. Wash your arms and hands. Go pee-pee now so you don't wet the bed. The guard stood. Get back over there, I'm gonna come down on you, motherfucker. The man remained where he was, in an unsanctioned part of the cage. Then he continued to rock, squatting, focused on the space between his feet. I'm going to count to 3, the guard yelled. The man, in an almost deliberate provocation, reached out and touched the fence. That was it. The guard got up, and a few seconds later returned with another guard. The second guard was carrying something that looked like a fire extinguisher. They opened the cage. As they did, the man looked up, suddenly afraid. His eyes were wide with wonder and surprise as they lifted him to his feet and dragged him out of the cage. A few feet away, they dropped him on the pavement, and with the help of 2 more guards, they tied his hands and feet with plastic handcuffs. He did not resist. Then they stepped away, and the first guard, the one who had warned him, aimed the hose and sprayed him head to toe with a substance Zeitoun could not immediately discern. Pepper spray, Todd said. The man disappeared in the haze and screamed like a scalding child. When the smoke cleared, he was cowering in a fetal position, wailing like an animal, trying to reach his eyes with his hands. Get the bucket, the guard said. Another guard came over and dumped a bucket of water on the screaming man. They didn't say another word. They left him screaming and soon moaning, soaked and gassed on the pavement behind the Greyhound station. After a few minutes, they dragged him to his feet and returned him to the cage. You have to wash the pepper spray off, Todd explained. Otherwise, you get burned, blistered. That night, Emery's was beef stew. Zeitoun ate. The smell of pepper spray hung in the air. The previous night had been calm compared to the day, but this night brought more fury, more violence. Other prisoners had been added to the cages throughout the evening, and now there were more than 70 at Camp Greyhound. They were angry. There was less space, more agitation. There were challenges issued by the prisoners to the guards, and soon more pepper sprays. Always the procedure was the same. A prisoner would be removed from his cage and dragged to the ground nearby in full view of the rest of the prisoners. His hands and feet would be tied, and then sometimes with the guard's knee on the back, he would be sprayed directly in the face. If the prisoner protested, the knee would dig deeper into his back. The spraying would continue until his spirit was broken. Then he would be doused with the bucket and returned to his cage. Zeitoun had watched elephants as a boy when a Lebanese circus passed through Jabala. Their trainers used large steel hooks to pull the beasts one way or the other, to prod or punish them. The hooks looked like crowbars or ice picks, and the trainers would grab the elephants between the folds of their hide and pull or twist. Zeitoun thought of the trainers now. These guards, too, had been trained to deal with a certain kind of animal. They were accustomed to hardened maximum security prisoners, and their tools were too severe to work with these men, so many of them guilty of the smallest crimes, curfew violations, trespassing, public drunkenness. The night dragged on. There were bursts of screaming, wailing, arguments broke out among prisoners. Guards would leap up, remove a man, put him in a new cage, but the fighting continued. The prisoners this night were wired, agitated. Zeitoun and Nassar brushed whatever dust they could over their hands and arms and necks to cleanse themselves, and they prayed. The guilt Zeitoun now felt was profound and growing. Kathy had been right. He should not have stayed in the city, and he certainly should not have stayed when she asked him every day after the storm to get out. "I'm so sorry, Kathy," he thought. He could not imagine the suffering Kathy was enduring now. She had said every day that something bad could happen, something unexpected, and now she had been proven right. She did not know if he was alive or dead, and every indication would point to the latter. Anything in this prison would be tolerable if they could only call her. He did not want to imagine what she was telling the kids, what kinds of questions they would be asking. But why not allow the prisoners their phone call? Anyway, he approached the question. He couldn't get the logic in prohibiting calls. It was troublesome, maybe, to escort the prisoners into the station to make the calls, but wouldn't the calls end up relieving the prison of at least some of the jailed? Any municipal jail, he figured, expects many of their prisoners to leave within a day or two, through bonds or drop charges or any number of outcomes for the small-time offenders. The ban on phone calls was, then, purely punitive, just as the pepper spray of the child man had been born of combination of opportunity, cruelty, ambivalence, and sport. There was no utility in that, just as there was no utility in barring all prisoners from contacting the outside world. "Oh, Kathy," thought Kathy, "I am so sorry. Zachary, Nadama, Aisha, Sophia, I am so very sorry tonight that I was not and am not with you." By 2 or 3 in the morning, most of the prisoners were asleep, and those who remained awake with Zeitoun were quiet. Again, Zeitoun refused to sleep on the pavement and got only occasional rest by draping himself over the steel rack. He knew the conditions had begun to take a very real toll on his psyche. He had been angry until now, but he had been thinking clearly. Now the connections were more tenuous. He had wild thoughts of escape. He pondered whether something very bad might happen to him here, and throughout the night he thought of the child man and heard his screams. Under any normal circumstances he would have leapt to the defense of a man victimized as that man had been, but that he had to watch, helpless, knowing how depraved it was. This was punishment for the other prisoners, too. It diminished the humanity of them all.